Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you. We're going to wait maybe one more minute for more participants to get here, but I'm seeing all the hellos in the chat feature, which is great to have so many international registrants, even though you have a time difference. So it's great to have you here. Okay, all right. So I'm going to start with the introduction, and then our panelists are going to take over. Hello again. Welcome to this joint webinar of the Women in ORMS or the WORMS Forum and Informs. This is through the Informs Speaker Program. It's a joint webinar. My name is Banafshe Bizad. I'm the current president of WORMS, and I'm very excited to have you all here. Thank you for your interest and thank you for taking the time to be present. As you can see, our topic is about journal and paper publication process and writing papers that will be chosen for publication. We have two very amazing speakers, Dr. Margaret Brando and Dr. Alice Smith. None of them needs my introduction. They're very well known and well established in the field, but just to have the official process here, Dr. Brando is the professor of management science and engineering at Stanford University, and Dr. Smith is also a professor of industrial and systems engineering at Auburn University. Before we start, I want to briefly talk about WORMS and also the Informs Speakers Program. So WORMS is one of the forums of Informs. It was established in 1995 with the main purpose of encouraging discussion and interaction among individuals who have interest in the issues facing women and their relationship to the profession of operations research and management science. I would like to encourage you to please become a WORMS member if you are not. It's very easy whenever you are becoming an Informs member or when you are renewing your Informs membership, you can always choose WORMS as one of the forums that you wanna be part of it. Even right now, if you don't wanna wait till you're renewing your membership, you can ask us and we can send you a proper form to become a WORMS member. We are really trying to expand our membership, so we really appreciate your support if you become a WORMS member. About the Informed Speakers Program, this is a great program which helps you and your organization to have amazing speakers for your next event. So you can actually save time by asking Informs to introduce the speakers for your events. It could be either in person or virtual, in general in the field of operations research, analytics, and management science. You can save substantial amount of money because they provide financial support to different chapters and organizations. And you can go to the website of the speakers program. All the details are there, but there's an online form which you can complete and basically request the speaker for your next event. So I'm going to stop here, and Margaret will share her screen. The order is that Margaret will present first, and then Alice, and then we'll go over Q&A. So feel free to use the chat feature to put your questions there, and then we will just go in the order based on your questions at the end. So please, Margaret.
Okay, I think you stop share and I start share.
Sure, yeah, I do stop share.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. It's great to see so many people joining this webinar. And I think what this webinar shows is that for many of us, publication is like super important to our career. If you have an academic career, you're a grad student, you're a professor, it may be even in industry, it's very, very important to know how to publish in journals. So what I want to do is share with you some of my hard-earned wisdom. I'll try not to veer into too many horror stories. So I have lined up my thoughts about publication success. I'm calling this 5 steps of publication success. Let me go through what those steps are. Okay, so the first thing, and I'll talk more about each of these, is problem selection, then analysis, followed by preparing your manuscript, submitting your manuscript to a journal, and revising your manuscript. And hopefully, eventually, at some point, your paper's all nice, revised, you manage to publish it in a journal. Here, I showed pictures of the Informs journals. So let's go through each of these steps. Okay, so the first thing is problem selection. If you want your paper to be published, you have to write a great paper. And if you want to write a great paper, you have to solve a problem that's important and that people care about. So that's the first thing, is you have to select an important problem. I've observed that you could write the most exquisite paper in the world, but if it's not about a problem that people care about, or it's not an important problem, it will not get published. On the other hand, if you take a really important problem, like let's say COVID right now might be an example, I don't know, shipping medicines in the COVID supply chain, even if you do a simple analysis, that will be viewed as important and a reasonable paper. So step one, find a really important problem. But of course, it has to be a problem where you can add value. And only you can determine whether your analysis can add value. But I think another important thing, when I talked about importance, sometimes it might be a problem that you think is important and maybe other people haven't yet realized is important. So I've observed that some of the best scholars are really quite fearless. They have vision and they think, you know what, this is an important problem. I'm going to do some analysis and publish this. And it's maybe a little bit riskier, but I think in general, great problems are sometimes bold and innovative. So problem selection. Okay, so you've selected your problem. You're going to do some analysis. And here's Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting doing some analysis. I like this picture. So the first thing in the analysis, of course, is figuring out what sort of analysis you're going to do. And it has to be appropriate to the problem. I think I've observed that sometimes people have a hammer and they're looking for a nail. Like I do XYZ type of analysis. I'm going to make it fit this problem. That's fine as long as it is indeed appropriate for the problem. So appropriate type of analysis. Sometimes collaborators are useful. Like I found, especially in rather bold type, multidisciplinary type of problems, that it's extremely helpful to work with collaborators from a different discipline who have very different viewpoint from me. So for example, in health policy, I work with collaborators from Stanford Medical School who can tell me nobody cares about that problem. Everybody cares about that problem, whatever. They can help make the analysis great. So appropriate analysis and collaborators. The next thing is to figure out the sweet spot versus the sour spot. Okay. The sweet spot, when we're doing analysis, we're always making simplifying assumptions. The sweet spot is when you've made realistic assumptions and you can come up with useful insights. The sour spot is when you made unreasonable assumptions and the insights are not very useful. So always, analysis is really an art. So you're working on the problem. It's a great problem, and you're finding the right balance. So then the next thing is the findings. Did you find out something interesting and important about that problem? One thing I would advise here when thinking about articles is you don't want to slice the salami too thin. And what I mean by that is, as a general rule, it's not a good idea to write papers that are each an epsilon variant of the last one you wrote. It would be much better to have each paper be a full contribution. Of course, not too much, but there's that balance. And then one other thing I want to mention, this is advice given to me when I was a very, very junior assistant professor. He said, let's say you analyze something and it's kind of marginal. It might be best for you to just put that back in your desk drawer instead of trying to publish it. And the reason is, when you publish a paper, let's say it was a very, very minor contribution, kind of marginal, people will pick that paper up and say, oh, this person's not a very good scholar. This is not a very good paper. And so his suggestion was, if you come up with something where it's really not fully formed or important, maybe stick it back. I guess in this case, it's a metaphorical desk drawer. Stick it in your, later folder on your desktop. So maybe set aside something that is not that impactful yet, and maybe later you'll figure out how to make it impactful. And I have done that, where I set a problem aside, and then later I suddenly realized, oh, if I think about it this way, it'd be a much better problem. Okay, so you've done your analysis, and now you need to write your paper. So here I've got Charles Dickens writing one of his novels. Now, this is not really meant to be a joke, because in fact, I think that writing your manuscript is just like writing a story. Hopefully, it could be like a novel, but let's not make too much of it. So when you're writing your manuscript, you have to think about, what is my main message and what is my story? Some of this may involve framing. So for example, we have, with one of my PhD students, who recently wrote some papers about vaccination, allocating scarce vaccinations for COVID. But we decided to frame it more generally as allocating scarce vaccines, and how do you think about that problem? So as you're writing, you've got to think about, how am I going to frame this in a way that make people read it and think, I get what you're saying. This is really useful, interesting, important, should be published. Of course, along the way, you need to be providing insights into what your solution told you. So you've got some findings. Now you've got to be able to distill them into some key insights. A lot of the work I do with, say, physicians at Stanford Medical School, they're always saying, I understand, but I'm just a dumb doctor. I fully disagree on that, but I'm just a dumb doctor. Could you just tell me your main message? Like, what should I, as a physician or public health policymaker, get from this? And you should be able to say what that is in a few sentences. So very important to in your story, be having understand what the insights are and make them very, very clear. Of course, you've got to think about how you're going to organize your paper. It's got to be clear. Figures and tables, super important. They're a great way to represent a lot of information, and I think they should be picked very carefully. Your paper should be complete. And by that, I mean, you should write it in a way that another scholar could reproduce your results. What we tend to do, and I've noticed that journals do this a lot now, we tend to have pretty detailed supplemental appendices. So very, very important to be complete. Even if it's later in the appendix, be complete. And finally, and I can't stress this enough, is professionalism. When you write a paper, you should make sure that there's not one single comma out of place, not one single typo, that not one single repeated sentence, not one single misspelling. I know when I've reviewed papers, I view a paper that's carefully done much more positively than a paper that is clearly a little bit careless. So super important to be your own worst enemy, really. Another thing you can do when preparing your manuscript for submission, you can show it to a friend or maybe an enemy. Show it to someone who's really going to critique you and give you some feedback about, this is good, this is bad, I have no idea what you're talking about. Very, very important to prepare a manuscript that's as good as you can possibly make it. I don't believe in submitting and seeing what happens. I believe in making the absolute best manuscript before I even submit. And sometimes it's also about the main message. I recently wrote a paper about diversity in the Inform's editorial boards. And I wanted the paper to be fair, balanced, accurate, but also impactful. So what I did is, before I finished the paper, I showed it to like 5 or 6 journal editors, 6 or 8 good academic friends, and got all of their feedback, so that before I even submitted it, I tried to make it as good as possible. And by the way, if you want, you can download that paper from the Inform's website. Anyway, so you've prepared your manuscript and now you're ready to toss it in. See, that's Rico from Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite. Love this picture. So you got select which journal you're going to submit to. And of course, this is really intertwined with the previous step. When you're writing the paper, you've got to think about what journal am I going for? Am I going for an operations research journal? Am I going for an operations management journal? Am I going for a specialty journal in the field outside of OR? So you got to think about which journal you want to submit to, and read some sample papers and figure out who the target audience is. So generally speaking, what I would do is I would look at the journal I'm interested in submitting the paper to, and find one of the very best sample papers from that journal and write my paper in a similar style. So maybe similar format. So for example, in medicine, almost every paper in medical journals, introduction, methods, results, discussion. In OR journals, it tends to be very different, background and literature review, main analysis, etc. But either way, figure out the length and format of the journal you are trying to submit to, and write a paper that looks like the best paper in that journal that you saw. And then finally, of course, you've got to have a cover letter. Again, this cover letter should just emphasize the key insights. We studied this important problem and we got these insights. Okay, so you submit your paper to the journal. You have to wait a little while. I think that it can be useful. I usually have a rule that if after 3 months I haven't heard anything, it's time to ping the journal. I think in general, that's not being obnoxious. That's just being useful, saying, wonder what's happening with my paper. And that sometimes, the editor will come back and say, oh, yes, thank you. I'll ping that reviewer and we'll get that to you soon. So you wait, and hopefully some reviews come back. Now, then you get your reviews back and you have to revise or resubmit somewhere else. One of the things I tell my students all the time is get used to rejection. To get as far as you've gotten in your academic career, you had to be a great student. To, get from undergraduate to grad school, you had to be a great student. To get from grad school to professor, you had to be great researcher and scholar, whatever. So many times people have gotten to this point in their career used to success all the way. And I feel like, especially in the journal process, you got to get used to rejection or at least criticism. So anyway, you get your reviews back. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So I think the first thing you have to do is try to understand the reviewer comments. And there's a huge amount of variability is what I've found. Sometimes reviewer comments are extremely helpful and insightful. You're like, oh my gosh, I never really did explain that. Or, oh yes, I really should extend the analysis. Sometimes there may be a little bit off topic, like you should cite all of my papers, or I really think you've done something different. But either way, you need to understand what the reviewers have told you and figure out how you're going to respond to those comments. Generally speaking, we develop a response to reviewers where point by point, you look at each comment and you decide, you describe how you have responded to that comment. And I think there's really here a balance between too little responding to comments and too much. So for example, I'm not really a fan of citing the reviewer's work unless it's truly relevant. So I might say, we looked at the references that this reviewer suggested, and it seemed that this one was relevant, but this one wasn't. So we added this one. So you've got to think about responding to comments. But if you want your paper to be accepted, generally speaking, you ought to respond to every comment in some way. You can't just say, I don't like your comments. So very difficult and very hard on the ego, but it has to be done. And I really think that what you should do when doing this is think about how you can strengthen your paper. There's only been maybe 1 or 2 times where I withdrew my paper because I just thought the reviewer has a very different vision for what this work is, and I really don't want to go down that road. But in general, I really, really try hard to respond to what the reviewers are saying in a wholehearted way, honestly thinking to myself, how can this improve the paper? And then finally, I can't stress this enough, perseverance. Someone once told me, oh, I mean, you have so much success, you've written so many papers. I'm like, yeah, but I didn't tell you about all the papers that got rejected, right? You only see the ones that got published. So okay, your paper got rejected. Then think about, okay, just have some honest thought about why did they reject it? I wonder how it could be different. Is it suitable for a different journal? Should I add more analysis, or should I still think it's a great paper. I'm just going to try another journal. And as when I mentioned point one here, I did say there's vagaries in the reviewer comments. And that is true. Sometimes you just get reviewers who didn't like your paper for whatever reason. You send it to another equally good journal and they take it. So perseverance, very important. So hopefully, if you've done all this, you've got a great problem, you've analyzed it well, you've written a great manuscript and you revised it, then hopefully your paper will be published. So this is a very quick, high-level overview of my 5 steps to publication success. And now I will turn it over to Alice, who's going to talk more about the journal side of this process.
Hey, thanks, Margaret. That was really excellent, and your message really resonated with me as a veteran author, also an editor. It was right on point. So yeah, I'm focusing more on what happens behind the scenes, if I can say that, behind the scenes from the author. And of course, I'm focusing on scholarly journals. So these are some questions that are well-known questions, and pretty much every author at some time or another has these questions. How are journals organized? What happens when I submit a paper? How are my editors and reviewers selected? What are they looking for? What about ethics, or what are the ethical concerns, both from an author's perspective and from a journal's perspective? How can I be a reviewer? How can I be a good reviewer? And what about maybe becoming an editor at some point? So this is what I'm going to quickly take a run through, and I am going to move quickly because I know we want to allow plenty of time for Q&A. So these are some key aspects of journals. Of course, nowadays, every journal has a web presence, and the website is full of information. And you will want to look at those websites before you decide which journal you want to submit to or get involved with. And of course, the mission and scope statement's extremely important. What kind of papers do they publish? What topics? What type of technology and theory are they looking for? And I will say at my journal, so I'm editor-in-chief of Inform's Journal on Computing, we desk reject over 40% of the papers that come in. And desk reject means they never go out for review. And one of the big reasons is they don't fit in our scope and mission. And authors can avoid that kind of extra pain and problems, and editors too, if they just look at the fit between your paper and what the journal typically publishes. So how often do they print? Are they monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, and so on? Who are the editorial boards? The editor-in-chief. There's typically area editors or department editors, associate editors. There's almost always some advisory group of esteemed persons, and there's always one or more managing editors. And all of these people you need to keep in mind, besides the managing editor, are generally uncompensated volunteers. There's a lot of criticism in the scholarly peer review process, especially in our field. It takes so long. Well, yes, sometimes it does. But you do have to remember that we all have our day jobs, and these are not our day jobs. They're extra things. They're things we love to do, but sometimes life gets in the way. There's a lot of moving pieces, and they are volunteer. There's always a publisher. Often that publisher is the sponsor, for example, Informed, sometimes not. You can also, of course, look at things like impact factors, which you can see up. Journals usually always listed if they have one. I'm not going to get into impact factors. That's a separate webinar and the pros and cons, but you'll want to look at where the journal is abstracted and its relative prestige, impact, respect within the field. I think those are important aspects. So typically, these are the editorial structure. I've already talked about that. So what happens when you submit an article? Well, almost always a plagiarism check is made. And so this goes out and it takes your article and it goes everywhere it can find on the web, and it finds a lot of stuff. And it produces this really nice little package that is available to editors and, depending on the journal, sometimes to reviewers, that give all the matches. They're all sorted by frequency and color coding. So it's pretty easy for an editor or a reviewer to go through and see if plagiarism, including self-plagiarism, is an issue they want to address. And I do this with every paper that comes to me as an editor. Some journals do repeat submission of checks, and this is to avoid a paper that's been rejected. And authors sometimes will try to go under the radar to resubmit it, which is not really the proper thing to do. The editor, of course, checks it for suitability. I talked about desk rejects. So typically a desk reject is done at some editorial level. It could be editor-in-chief. It could be department or area editor. It could even be an associate editor that says this doesn't fit. This isn't going to be competitive. It's not within our scope. For whatever reason, there's a brief rationale given and it's sent back. We've all had desk rejected papers, or I have. I still get desk rejects, even though I know my way around this system. So sometimes it does happen. If you pass the desk reject, then it gets assigned to an area department or associate editor. And this person may or may not be known to you as the author. So for example, in my journal and on computing, we have editor-in-chief, area editor, associate editors. So authors obviously know I'm editor-in-chief. They also know the area editor. They actually submit directly to the area they choose. That we have 10 technical areas. They do not know who the associate editor is. So that is to shield that person to remain kind of behind the scenes, really behind the scenes, dark, just like a reviewer. Okay. And the area editor in this case decides, usually based on the technical area, which of the associate editors is most proper. Sometimes you also get workload issues that the area editor is trying to balance. You also need to avoid conflict of interest, which is things like same institution, if you have an authorship relationship or an advisory relationship. Reviewers in our field, typically 2 and 3. As an editor, I will tell you, to get 2 or 3 reviewers, I typically have to send out 8 or more invitations. So most invitations are declined. And so sometimes if I send out 8, I might get 6. It might be my lucky day, right? It's a bell-shaped curve. I might get 0. And again, this is part of why things take a long time. And where do the reviewers come from? Well, your reference list for sure, especially more recent references. Some journals will allow you to suggest reviewers. I will tell you, as an editor, I rarely use that, but occasionally it can be useful. Of course, the editor should have knowledge of the field. Some of the reviewers that I invite say no because they're too busy or whatever, but they're nice enough to say, but this person will be a really good reviewer for this paper. So that kind of widens the web, and I use a lot of those reviewers. Sometimes I have to do a web search. It's maybe a niche area. I don't know it so well. I go out and find who's publishing in this area. Some systems, like the one in Elsevier, actually goes through and does this for you if you ask it, and searches and brings up reviewers. I already talked about conflict of interest. Journals are either single blind or double blind. So if they're single blind, the reviewers and the editors, of course, know who the authors are, but the authors don't know who the reviewers and sometimes the editors are. If it's double blind, the reviewers don't know, or they're not supposed to know, who the authors are. And you need to find that out because there's different ways to submit papers, whether it's single blind or double blind. Okay, so what are they looking for? I've already talked about appropriate for the journal. Clarity is really important. If the paper's not clear, it's not going to go anywhere. Readers have to understand the purpose of the paper, what happened, what were the results. We're always talking about contribution, 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 contribution. But it's a really important word. What is this contributing to the literature, to the body of knowledge? And if it doesn't do something novel or innovative or pushing the boundary in some way, it could still be solid work, but it's not scholarly journal work. And a lot of authors don't make that distinction. Well, I did this work, technically it's sound. Okay, but what's the contribution to the literature? And you have to make this very clear in the paper. In fact, you want to make it clear in the abstract, the introduction, conclusions, and some other places. You have to keep telling the reader, this is our contribution. It needs to be well structured. It needs to be thorough. Journals have page budget. Every page I publish costs the journal money, and it means another page I can't publish. So this is not like a term paper in high school. Well, how long does it need to be? Or it has to be a minimum of 30,000 words. We need succinct writing. We need it to be complete, but not overly long. This is very important. You need to show you have a command of the literature. A lot of reviewers get upset if you're missing certain chunks of the literature, because even though your work might be sound, you haven't put it in the proper context and scope. How are you portraying things? In our field of OR, we have a lot of typically numeric results. How are you showing them? Are these legible, or do they add value to the reader? I will tell you, as a reader and an editor, you don't want to, and reviewer, you don't want to see page after page of tables. I mean, it's like, why do I have to do all the work? Tell me what's important. Show me. Picture's worth 1,000 words and 1,000 entries and tables. Again, what Margaret said, yeah, we are kind of writing a story or a novel, but we're not going to write it like a novel. Okay. So we want it to be simple. This is not the time to wow the readers with your knowledge of really fancy English and long sentences. Clarity, simplicity, succinctness. This is really important. So how to be a good reviewer? I threw this in because I know many of you are more junior people. So you should only accept reviews that you're technically competent to review, and you can get it done within the time frame. Okay, and obviously, if you have a conflict of interest, you must let the editor know. You need to make your comments constructive and impartial. Again, back to professionalism, which Margaret mentioned. This is a professional report. And you can say both good things and bad things. Reviewers in our field tend to be fully negative or almost all negative. You can definitely say positive things, but it's not the time to try to be nice. You need to be frank and constructive. You don't need to review the English. If this thing ends up getting published, they have production people who do this. But if you see English problems, especially if they obscure meaning, definitely point it out. And it also, some of this goes back to the professionalism that Margaret mentioned. If I see typos in a paper or things that are obviously formatted poorly, that does not speak well to the authors. It sends a message to the reviewers that we don't care that much about giving you the full package. We don't care that much about giving you our best. And these are not good messages to send. Return your review on time. If you do that as an editor, I will love you because they hardly ever come in on time. But at least if I send you a reminder, get it in. Don't keep putting me off and then never review the paper. This is one of the reasons that a few papers have very long review times, because a reviewer has made a commitment and doesn't do it. And this happens more often than you think. If you review the paper and the paper is not rejected, then there'll probably be one or more revisions. You've also signed on to review one or more of those revisions. It makes it very difficult for the editorial process for the reviewer set to not be consistent from one version to the other. I would say publishing in papers and reviewing for publishing in journals and reviewing for journals is usually a prerequisite to thinking about becoming an editor. So ethics as an editor, I've seen unbelievable things happen in ethics. I could tell you horror stories that's going on in our field. I'm talking about operations research, and even by some people who are well known in the field. Obviously, I cannot name names, but there's a lot of ethical issues and a lot of game playing. So we've already talked about plagiarism. One of the big issues that I see is how much overlap can you have with the conference paper? And that is a very open issue. Right now, the answer is, well, it depends. And it depends on your editors and your reviewers. Some editors take a hard line and they don't want to see hardly any overlap. Some editors are like, yeah, sure, it's the conference paper's preliminary, just roll it in, roll in the figures, roll in the results, and then you add to it. The Journal on Computing, we devised and implemented a few years ago a conference paper policy to try to make this more standard, because even within the journal it wasn't standard. And so we have very specific rules. If your paper is an outgrowth of a conference paper, what you do to make everything transparent. And obviously you can't plagiarize figures and whatnot. Data integrity, of course, I would hope, I don't even have to say this, and fraudulent outcomes. Transparency in research is incredibly important. It's getting more and more important. At Journal on Computing, we have a data policy and we have a software policy. So data sets are in the public domain unless there's a reason for security and secretness. Otherwise, those go up with the paper. If the paper is software dependent, we also want the software up there. So it can all be transparency above board. We're sharing everything. There's not the question of what's going on here and does it really work. You cannot submit the same or basically the same paper concurrently. This is unethical. And when you submit the paper to the journal, you'll have to check a box or something that says it is not under submission elsewhere. This still goes on. You don't get it with a plagiarism check because this is concurrent. What you do get it with, and I've had this happen multiple times, the editors are picking the same reviewer. The reviewer is saying, oh, I just reviewed this paper for XYZ journal and it's still under consideration. So conflict of interest, again, if you have a conflict of interest as a reviewer, for example, make sure you report it. And authorship, I find, is a big playground for ethical violations. Who gets to be an author? What's the order of the author? These are serious things. And especially as a junior person, you may not even be aware of the importance and what being an author means. And so these are things you should have a frank discussion with your co-authors. You should talk about, is that person really an author or not? Or should we just acknowledge them? And who should be the ordering of the authors. Corresponding author in most situations is not regarded as an extra achievement. It typically is the person at the first author in the list, in the ordered list, who's at a permanent location. But some countries, such as in China, being a corresponding author is a big deal to them. And so authors tend to fight over that. And so you need to be a little bit aware of that. Okay, my last slide. What about editorial work? Well, you have to think about, is it for you or not? I mean, in my case, I love doing editorial work and obviously started back actually as an assistant professor, as an associate editor, and have done quite a few different roles. If you're interested, again, typically you start with authorship and reviewing, and you let it be known that you're interested. You volunteer, you work with mentors, and see at some point, if you get an invitation to the journal you want to join, then you should seriously think about it. You know, there's a lot of benefits, especially for networking. It makes you a better author, I think, to do editorial work. The cons are it can take a lot of time, and sometimes that time's not very predictable. And sometimes, even as an associate editor, you can get caught up in some very difficult situations that can be very stressful. So there's pros and cons. I think there's more pros than cons, but that's an individual, of course, decision. So really quick run. Hopefully I didn't overstep my time, and I will be quiet now for questions and answers for both of us.
Okay, thank you very much. It was great. I learned a lot personally, and I'm seeing very good questions in the chat and the Q&A feature. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and either of you please feel free to answer these questions. So the first question is that, would you please let us know how to find an appropriate collaborator, what factors you consider, and how you find the right person?
I'll just jump in on that one, since a lot of what I do is interdisciplinary. I think you want to find someone who will work as hard as you do. So I don't want a person whose name is just being put on my paper and gave me one or two ideas. That doesn't work for me. So someone who works as hard as you do, but also someone who is interested in the problem and has a different perspective from you and can add value. And, you know, I think finding collaborators is a bit of a process. You might not know immediately in advance that this person's right. You might work with someone and think, oh, never again. Or you might work with someone and think, this worked perfectly. So I have some collaborators at Stanford that I've written numerous papers with, along with our grad students. And because we mesh, they're adding value, they work hard. We somehow the combined product is better than either of us could do alone. But it's a trial and error process. But I think in general, it's somebody who thinks the problem's important, and you think it's somebody who has the incentive to work on the problem with you and will work hard. Okay,
great, thank you. The next question is, how can we select between top-notch journals other than informed journals in OR and MS fields? For example, EJOR or IJPE, COR or IJPR?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. So when I look to see what paper my journal, what journal my paper should go to, I look at the reference list, because typically that's going to give me a really good idea. Are they publishing papers that are relevant to the new paper that I'm writing? If the answer is no, then that becomes a harder question. Then are they going to be interested in that? So that gives me a lot of clues. You know, I consider the reputation of the journal, where it's abstracted. I mean, I personally don't like to send to journals that are not abstracted in Web of Science, just because it's like the gold standard in our field. And I look some at impact factors have a lot of issues, but people do look at them. They're reported on promotion and tenure packages, so you don't want to ignore them, but look at that, look at where it's ranked in the field. Look at, you know, who else is publishing there? Are these people that you admire and respect? And I also try to judge the paper, like how good is it? And what I try to do is go for the quote best journal that I think the paper has a decent chance of getting accepted. But I usually have a plan B that, okay, if it's rejected here, then this journal could be a decent one. So it's a combination of things, but it is an important decision. And it's one that deserves a lot of thought before you submit a paper.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so next question, what is the point of a cover letter? What information is in the cover letter that is not in the abstract and vice versa?
Do you want to take that,
Margaret? Oh, I was going to let you take it.
Okay, I'll take it.
You know, articles.
You know, basically I ignore cover letters except if it's under an unusual circumstance. So for example, if you got a reject and resubmit decision, which honestly, I don't like those decisions, but they seem to be becoming more common in our field, you will definitely want to say this because your paper is going to be assigned a new number. This is a reject and resubmit and give the reference to the original paper number and so on. But other than that, you know, you keep it short and sweet, like I said, or if you've changed authors, if there's something going on with the paper that the editor and possibly the reviewers should know, then put it in. Otherwise, just say we're submitting it, we all agree, and we believe it's within your scope, and thanks a lot. Typical thing. There's no sense in trying to make a big case for the paper or buttering up the editor with the letter.
Okay, so what if when you receive the rejection decision letter, you find that some comments from reviewers clearly don't make any sense? Reviewers are wrong about certain things. What should we do? Or just should we just call it a bad luck? Or what do you think?
I think if all reviewers are wrong, then you didn't explain your work clearly. But I think if one reviewer is wrong, I recently just revised a paper and one reviewer said, your paper is clearly a non-stationary bandit problem. Well, it wasn't at all. It had nothing to do with that, although it was a stochastic dynamic decision-making process. And so, but the other two reviewers had more on-point comments. So what I did, and this third reviewer also said, please cite my work, essentially. So what we did is we said, well, we added a paragraph to the introduction saying, this is not a bandit problem for these reasons. You know, just sort of explaining it. And we responded to reviewers saying, you know, our work differs from that problem for this reason. We've added some explanation and citations in the literature review. So I think sometimes when the reviewer is off base, assuming it's only one reviewer or one comment, it's perfectly fine to explain why they're off base. But one rule I generally have is in response to every single reviewer comment, you should add something to the paper. And I mean, by add, I mean a word or a sentence. I don't mean rewrite the paper. So for example, in this case, we did add a paragraph in citations, but sometimes you just, you know, add a sentence to the limitations discussion. Add a qualifier to one of the sentences in your abstract, you know, results are somewhat positive or whatever. So if the reviewer is off base, I think it's perfectly fine in a very respectful way to explain, but generally I do add something to the paper. You just keep, again, in Alice's vein, keeping it short.
I'll just add very briefly to that because I had this situation in one of the papers I submitted. And the first author is my student who's now on the faculty at Purdue. And he's like, I don't know what to do with this comment because it was from a reviewer who wanted us to add a bunch of papers and the papers were not relevant. And so he didn't know what to do. I immediately went to the editor-in-chief of the journal and said, look, this is what's going on. If I am an editor-in-chief, and I would want to know this if this is going on in my journal. And of course, we don't know who the reviewer was. And I said, you know, we're not going to do it. And we wrote back to the reviewer and said, we see no purpose of adding these papers. And the editor-in-chief totally agreed with our assessment. So if you see something that looks fishy in terms of ethics, take it to the editor-in-chief, or something of bias. I've seen this too,
Yes.
where unfortunately we still have reviewers that have bias, often gender bias. If you see that, please take it to the editor-in-chief, because again, we don't necessarily see that, but we need to know what's happening.
Yes, I agree with that. We had a reviewer, we wrote a paper about hospital operations management at Stanford Children's Hospital, and it's some of the projects we did. And one of the reviewers was just convinced it was lean manufacturing, and it wasn't. And we added a sentence or two about lean manufacturing and references. And the person then in the revision came back and said, but you didn't talk about lean manufacturing. And so then I just went back to the editor and said, that's not what we've done. So as Alice said, when someone has a bias, in this case, it was sort of an ideological bias, you should go back to the editor.
Okay, great. All right, so next question, what to do when reviewer 1 says do A, reviewer 2 says do not A, and the editor says do as they tell you. What should I do, or should I just go to another journal?
That's an editor not doing their job. And I've had that happen. And if an editor is not doing their job, and occasionally it happens, of course, not at Informs journals, but in other journals, you're stuck. And yeah, you have to either kind of, you can play them off a little bit and say, well, reviewer 1 wanted the paper shorter and you want the paper longer. So we've split the middle and you know, had left the length the same, and see. But yeah, occasionally if the review, if you can get caught in a situation that isn't going to end well if you don't have an editor to help mediate some of this stuff.
But I also think you should pick whichever comment makes more sense to you and seems more reasonable, and do that. Again, in a brief way, you know, like I don't know, added the stochastic element to our analysis or whatever. And then you, in your response to the editor, you say the 2 reviewer comments were differing. We chose this. And then in your response to the other reviewer, you say, as requested by the other editor, in fact, we did something different for these reasons. So that's generally what I do, is I pick whichever one I think is better and do that. But then I do let the editor know, and I do let the other reviewer know in a really nice, respectful way why I chose one path versus the other. But yes, exactly that. I've had, your paper should be longer, your paper should be shorter.
Exactly.
What do you do? So in that case, I might shorten the paper and add a supplement to make them both happy, you know. So.
Right, yeah. Okay, so this is easy. Does associate editor know who are the authors?
Oh yeah, the editors all know, all the editors know who the authors are. Yes.
Okay, so how are replication study papers looked at by journals? Can a seminal paper in one region context be replicated in the author's local context?
I don't understand that question.
So I think
Margaret,
what
do
you're
you?
meaning is that, Margaret, do you have any answer, or do you want me to?
It depends if you're making an important contribution. I understand what you're saying. You know, you're saying we studied, let's say we studied XYZ strategy in entrepreneurship firms in Chile. Oh, now we studied entrepreneurship strategy in firms in, you know, Colombia or whatever. I think if that's the type of question you're asking, then if I were looking at that second paper about Colombia, I'd ask myself, are you adding something new and interesting and different? Right? It's all about the contribution.
All right, so this one is, please quantify contribution for authorship.
Many journals have a statement.
That's right.
The medical journals, you have to, there's like, approximately 10 different ways you could have contributed. Funding, problem inception, manuscript writing, analysis, data provision, critical review and revision of the final manuscript. I forget what all are, and you have to actually, for each author, say which parts of that they were involved in. But I think in general, an author needs to be somebody who contributed intellectually to the paper, who gave ideas, who helped with at least revising the initial manuscript. Usually one person takes the lead in writing, but they have to have done something significant enough to warrant authorship. I know in the medical field, authors get added willy-nilly, and I'm not a fan of that. I think more in operations research, we tend to be a little tighter with our list of authors. So I really ask, did this person make a significant contribution? If not, they go in the acknowledgements. I don't know if I answered your question. I mean, I think what I said is they had to have made a significant enough contribution.
Yeah, okay, all right, so this is good. I think what advice do you have for researchers doing cross-disciplinary work or work on topics that are new to operations domains? How does this preparation for publishing differ from more traditional topics?
I'll take that one if that's okay, since I do work
Absolutely.
in this area. There's two things. One, you got to figure out which way you're going to go with your journal. Are you going to go with more of an informed journal or more of a specialty journal in that new topic? So for example, we publish in internal medicine journals or public health journals, but we also publish in informed journals. So you got to pick which journal you're going for. That's one way. And the second thing is you have to sell people on why it's interesting and important. So you're doing something novel and interdisciplinary. That's actually great. Now you've got to sell me on it in your paper. You have to sort of explain to me. I think in general, and Alice could see if she agrees, as an editor, I used to be an area editor of operations research. We're looking for interesting things. We're looking for things that aren't just same old, same old. So I think multidisciplinary can be great. It's just you need to write it in a way and make sure you're sending it to the right journal for the way you've written it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to some of the questions in the chat because they came earlier than the rest of the questions under Q&A. So what steps can an early career academic take to get more involved in peer reviewing?
If you're still a doctoral student or even not, I mean, you can always let your advisor and your committee members know you're interested in reviewing, because chances are they get invited, and it's nice to be able to let them say, I don't have the time, but I have this PhD student or one who just graduated. And as a PhD advisor, I get my PhD students and started involved. I'm like, I'm going to look at this paper too, but I want you to look at it. I want you to write me a report, and I meld it and stuff like that. So that's a good place to get started. You can write the editors. I've had that happen where people will send me a CV and say, I'm interested in being a reviewer. I want to get on your reviewing list. And so all of the journals have mechanized systems where the reviewers, and you choose keywords, obviously input your basic identification information. So you have to be proactive. And then later you'll go like, you'll forget about those because you'll get so many requests to review papers. So you don't usually have to do that for very long. And if you're a good reviewer, okay, and by good, I already talked about what makes a good reviewer, then you're going to get invited again and again. And of course, if you publish, you get invited more because you've got a track record in the particular field.
Right. Okay. All right. So it's almost the end of the time, but Margaret and Alice agreed to stay a little bit longer. So we're going to stay for 10 more minutes and answer some of the other questions. So the next question is, would you ever send a paper back to the journal that rejects the paper? Which means just respond to the comments as if it was revised and resubmit.
You can't do that unless it was an explicit it's a reject and resubmit. So there's a decision called reject and resubmit I mentioned earlier, where the paper's rejected, but the editor, one of the editors, has said, we will consider your paper as a new submit, but then you send in the response to reviewers, and typically that stuff is maintained. And then in your cover letter, you would need to say that this is a reject and resubmit. You can't just do it uninvited. We actually had that happen in the journal, and it caused a lot of problems because it was like, well, no, we didn't give you a reject and resubmit, and now you're resubmitting it. And so no, that's not considered ethically proper if it's basically the same paper that's been revised.
I mean, I will say one thing. I had a paper rejected because the reviewer said you didn't do XYZ. We did do XYZ. It was in the supplement, but we hadn't put all the details in. So we actually went back to the editor and said, we hope you will get our paper reviewed again. In fact, we did do all of those things. It was like some technical details about, did you do calibration and probabilistic sensitivity analysis? And so in that case, it was just that the review was wrong. It was just saying you didn't do all these things that are needed in a top paper. And we in fact had done. And in fact, they did publish the paper eventually. But that was a case of where they just were very, very confused about what we had done. They didn't realize we had done all the things they were looking for.
But you always will need to go to the editor like Margaret did.
Yes.
You don't just submit it without advance warning to the editor.
We wrote a letter to the editor saying, you know, here's the issue. We hope you would let us submit it. Yeah. So.
And then related to reject and resubmit, sometimes they might ask to do a lot of extra work, for example, collect another data set or like change the model. So what is your opinion what is the sweet spot between going through the process and moving to another journal?
I think that certain informs journals, not the one Alice is editor-in-chief of, but they have developed the bad habit of saying, why don't you extend this to the infinite horizon case? You can put it in the supplement. Why don't you extend this to, you know, the stochastic case? And they basically want you to write 2 more papers and stick them in the supplement. You have to decide if you're willing to do that. I recently had a paper accepted again. I won't say which of our informs journals, but basically the reviewers just made us write another whole paper and stick it in. And another whole paper I might add was just comparison to other things in the literature and adding lots and lots and lots of computation. And we did it because the 2 students really wanted to have a paper in this prestigious journal. But you, the author, have to make a decision about how much extra work am I willing to do. If it makes the paper stronger and is not an unreasonable amount of time, I would do it. But if it's, you know, like just writing 2 more papers and sticking them in the supplement, and I literally have had that experience. Again, the student needed the publication, we did it, but you have to ask if you're willing to do that.
Okay, all right. So this is about probably like maybe Alice can answer this. So when do you think like faculty should volunteer to be in the editorial board, like as an assistant professor, or what is the process? How should they initiate?
Well, I mean, I started as an associate editor in one of the Informs journals as an assistant professor. I didn't volunteer. I was actually invited by the editor-in-chief, and I was actually very surprised. I was like, "Ooh, I'm so junior." It was scary, but I'm glad I said yes. So, you know, in my journal, we have, I think, gosh, close to 80 associate editors, and we're growing. So we've added some, and we really have a lot of attention to diversifying and bringing in a lot of earlier career people. I mean, traditionally my mindset was, oh, you really needed to be tenured to kind of be an editor, but I think that's changed, and we have quite a few assistant professors as associate editors. I will say I just had a case of one that I had to actually dismiss in a friendly way, but this person was an assistant professor, or still is, I guess. It happened recently, and obviously had other calls on his or her time and couldn't get the job done. I mean, I was sympathetic, but on the other hand, so I think it's up to the person. I think definitely editors are open and in fact are actually very encouraging in today's environment to get the new generation of scholars involved.
Okay, so how to increase the citation of our published articles?
Make them great articles.
Yeah, and write about problems that people care about.
And publish in good places that are abstracted.
Yes, so you know, Alice mentioned she likes to publish papers that are in Web of Science, and so like for the health related papers I publish, I want to make sure they're in PubMed, the National Library of Medicine website. So you want to at least, even if sometimes it might not be a top journal for whatever reason, like expediency, special issue, whatever, but if it's in a place people can find it and it's a good paper, then it will get cited on an important topic.
Just don't play gamesmanships. Nobody likes authors who do that where they're, oh, you cite my papers, I'll cite yours, or let me cite all my possible papers. I mean, people recognize that, and it does not speak well to the person as a scholar.
No, as Alice said, just write good papers that people can find.
Okay, I think this is a good question. So just wondering if theoretical contribution is required for a paper to be published, especially for empirical papers.
No, I don't think so.
No, but there has to be some generalization. It can't just be, this is what we did, this is specific to this particular thing we studied, this application or this particular context. So what we look for are what's generalizable, what are the general guidelines and insights that you can draw upon from your work and give to the community.
Right. Okay, so is it important to cite relevant journal publications? Is it equally important to cite relevant PhD dissertations?
I personally don't think you need to cite PhD dissertations unless it's totally something that's so relevant and no one would see it otherwise. I would generally
agree.
do that. But yes, I mean, I don't think you want a 5-page literature review. You just want to cite the most important articles and explain why yours is a contribution above and beyond those. That's all you want to do. And a lot of times I'll say lots of work has been done on XYZ topic, parenthesis, for example. But these papers focus on XYZ and we're doing something different. So I don't like cite the entire field. I might cite a survey paper or, you know, or if there's just a few relevant papers, cite them. But generally, I, as a rule, not always in the days of archive and whatever, but generally I do as much as possible try to cite peer-reviewed articles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just citing articles out in the open web. I always try to avoid that if at all possible, because you don't know the validity of those things.
Okay, has there been any discussions on how the journal revision process can be improved for the better? It seems that scholars will come across horror stories at some point in their careers. Some might agree that some part of the system is broken. Can we do better?
Well, we can always do better. I mean, what most people complain about is how long it takes. And every paper is different. And there's a lot of tail end papers. They sit with reviewers, or reviewers say they're going to review it and they don't. And as the editor, you're waiting and waiting. Sometimes editors sit on things. Sometimes there's conflicts and the editor needs to go out and get more reviews, and the authors don't necessarily see all this. So some of the time delay is legitimate, some is, you know, things that could be avoided in a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. As an editor, if I get a review that's either doesn't give any information or is personal or inappropriate or off target in some way, I will override the review, or I'll send it to the authors and say, just ignore that or whatever. So it is important as an editor to not recognize sometimes you get reviews that are not really proper for whatever reason. It does happen.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It comes from the editor. I know when I was area editor of operations research, I totally would override reviewers if I thought they were, had a point that was sort of off topic. And I would say to the author, I think this might be a little off topic, respond if you wish. Yeah, I think that good reviewing has to start with a good editor and good associate editors, and people helping the review process be fair and helpful.
Okay, all right, thank you. So there's one last question which I think is important. Does the credibility of authors affect your decision on accepting their paper?
I don't think it would accept a decision on accepting. It might give me a preconceived idea that it would hopefully be a good paper, but until I read the paper, I wouldn't know.
I say that comes into play more to me as if I'm asked to review a paper. It's also helpful for me to know who's writing it, because I know my field and I know the research groups, and I may say, oh, I want to review this even though I'm super busy because I want to see what they're doing. I think as editors, and certainly by the time it comes to an accept decision, I don't think it matters who the author is or their affiliation, because that's the same kind of thing, like where is it coming from? Because it's already been through different hands and different opinions. But, at my journal, we handle papers from big names and names we would all recognize it. And you know what? Their papers get rejected. My papers get rejected. Okay. Putting my name on the paper is not helpful, at least if it's not any guarantee. And so, everybody gets rejected papers, and we need to be mindful. The acceptance rate, I don't know at all in informs journals, but typically, 20% or whatever. That means 4 out of 5 papers are rejected. And we get some pretty high-powered authors who are in that reject. And that's just the nature of peer review and the way our scholarly system works.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alice, Margaret, for donating your time. It was great. It was very fruitful, very helpful. Thank you to Inform's staff, Tracy and Jill, who are always great and support us. And thank you to all of you who attended the seminar. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to read all the questions. I tried to cover the more generic ones, but hopefully we can continue this discussion sometimes later. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your day or night.
Thank you all, and best of luck in your publishing.
Yeah, and thanks for organizing this. Actually, this has been tons of fun for me. So if we ever want to do a part 2, I would be happy to participate.
Great, thank you very much.